you and your loved ones as well. Second, I just want to also thank Amjad, not only for this important webinar and digging into this question of anti-Palestinian racism, which I'm glad is slowly growing into the lexicon around Israel Palestine, but also thanking them for all the work that they're doing in the UK, especially in a community that's still grappling with these questions and in an environment which, when I was living and studying in the UK, could be very stifling when it comes to these conversations. So my full appreciation and solidarity for all the work that you do. Now, onto the topic of conversation for today. Naturally, something as big as a question of anti-Palestinian racism is hard to capture in the space of a few minutes, so I will by no means create a very comprehensive talk on this. But I did want to dedicate at least a few minutes that I have and the conversation afterwards to highlight at least a few themes or at least pointers for us to take into consideration as we continue investigating this idea of anti-Palestinian racism. It's something that we Palestinians are also trying to define, to clarify, to set guidelines for in our own ways, both formally and informally. So it's very much an experiment in what we're doing here. But I hope that I can give a few pointers to make us think different, think how do we identify these things? What are things that we may not have thought of as forms of anti-Palestinian racism, which we should be flagging for ourselves? And in many ways, the way to think about anti-Palestinian racism is really this attempt to kind of enshrine the Palestine, what we've been describing as the Palestine exception across many life, in terms of their rights, in terms of the public discourse, in terms of politics. This attempt to enshrine that Palestine exception is very much at the heart of what we're witnessing from government officials to universities to the media. And in essence, the three kind of themes I would want to discuss is how anti-Palestinian racism is manifested through these three issues: the denial of voice, denial. Naturally, there are many more things we can bring up, but these are the three I want to highlight. It's really this idea of this rejection and suppression of Palestinians and their allies of their right to speak, to act, and to be. So to dig into the first point, the denial of voice. Some of you might have heard this term about the idea of the permission to narrate. And this should be one of the foremost questions that people should be asking when we talk about Israel-Palestine. Who gets to speak about Israel and Palestine, especially who gets to speak for Palestinians on behalf of Palestinians and articulates their struggle? What can tend to be seen, I'm sure some of you may have encountered this in your own lives, there's this kind of both implicit and explicit effort to portray Palestinians as these untrustworthy sources. You can't trust them as people to interpret events on the ground or to be translators of facts on the ground, to articulate their own experiences. We're often kind of assumed, even subconsciously, as being too biased, as too emotional, as too radical. And this is not just there's that sort of emotional kind of inclination sometimes that exists in many of us, and this is also very reflective, for example, how we think about Islamophobia, anti-Arab racism, many other communities of color, and any other kind of minorities. And this manifests sometimes in very specific ways. So and sometimes in well-meaning ways. So oftentimes, maybe some of you are students, when you're doing a research paper, and there can be sometimes an inclination to believe that Israeli historical sources, for example, archive pieces, maybe books written by Israeli historians, even Israeli human rights organizations, all of whom do fantastic work, very fact-based, accurate work that's often done in solidarity with Palestinians. But then there ends up being this kind of an implicit assumption that somehow, because it's by an Israeli source, that is somehow more credible, that is what is fact-based, and that it's somehow better or more strategic in order to use those Israeli sources in order to make your argument or to prove something. Now, this is not, of course, to say that you cannot use Israeli sources, but when you're having these, what you're reading on a day-to-day basis and what you're citing, or what other people are citing on the day, by the Israelis more professional, or even international sources more professional and more trustworthy, and the Palestinians somehow aren't. And you even have this sometimes in media reports, or the New York Times or anything else. You oftentimes, and then speaking as an editor, you can often find that these reports will sometimes hear from Palestinians and quote Palestinians as the victim of said practice on the ground. And this is, of course, an important voice. But then the expert to kind of give the big picture or to articulate, what is happening or how to understand these policies, etc. It's often an Israeli expert or an international expert rather than a Palestinian expert. This tends to be quite a dominant trend that I think should be challenged, and this kind of implicitly reproduces this denigration of Palestinians as being allowed to narrate their experiences in their. Now, thankfully, this has actually been changing of late, especially since the events of May and June. Many of my colleagues and many Palestinians across the board have seen this more proactive effort by media outlets to actually try to engage with Palestinian experts to directly give the microphone to Palestinians. And this is very much credit to a lot of grassroots work, civil rights groups, this constant push from the ground up to really change these discourses which did not exist before. But there's still a long way to go. I'm hoping that someone will be able to do a project on this in the UK. But about this time last year, we had Dr. Maha Nassar do a study, for example, of major American media outlets like the New York Times and Washington Post. And she looked at, for example, a number of op-eds that were written by Palestinians, op-eds being very influential, op-eds editorials being very influential ways of shaping how the public perceives Israel-Palestine. And it was something shocking, like across the board, it was something like maybe 1% of all op-eds about Israel-Palestine were actually written by Palestinians. And you can imagine that it's not just for the sake of representation, but it's the substance of how opinion is being shaped. So these are just like a few examples in ways in which that denial of voice can be manifestations of this anti-Palestinianism. A second theme that I can bring up is denial of agency. Now, obviously, so what do I mean by denial of agency? Here, I especially want to focus on the idea of nonviolent resistance and the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. There are many examples I can bring, but I want to highlight these in particular. So the way that anti-Palestinianism exists, the active agency is that, as I'm sure many of you see from Israeli officials, and even now in public discourse and by politicians, there's this kind of belief that somehow Palestinian nonviolent resistance and things that we regard as nonviolence in any other setting is somehow itself a form of violence, or is perhaps driven by some kind of hostile or racist intent. And this can also be done sometimes in ways that we're not fully aware of. And I could bring examples on the ground here in Israel-Palestine, but a big one is, of course, BDS. The idea of the right to boycott or to divest from human rights abuses or to impose sanctions on they're taught in our history classes, and they have historical precedents from the global to the national level. We think about India, and their practice of nonviolence and boycotts against British colonialism. Think about the United States and Black Americans against Jim Crow and segregation. We think about South Africa, of course, against apartheid. And in the UK especially, this is particularly shocking, whereby, during the movement against apartheid, the UK was a prime hub and engine of the boycott movement against apartheid South Africa. And they were even, this was, of course, a lot of pushback from the authorities, but there was this very active movement that was even more far-reaching in the way that they want to practice BDS than the way it's being practiced now towards Israel. So we know that in any other setting, we have been revering this method. Yet somehow there's now being a Palestine exception being created to the right to boycott. And even those who might say, at worst, you've got people saying that it's somehow a form of terrorism or anti-Semitism, somehow harmful. Like maybe they have the right, but this is a dangerous method. It's not going to do you any good. But this is not what history has taught us, and this is not what we've been teaching ourselves about boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And what's particularly alarming, in addition to the issue of public discourse around BDS, is a very clear intent by officials from the top all the way to the ground to criminalize and demonize the right to participate in BDS for Palestine. And there's always this accusation that somehow because BDS singles out Israel as like one excuse. Palestinians have an issue with Israel. They are the ones calling for that movement. They're not asking for a movement against China, and which people should participate in if that is for a human rights cause, of course. But Palestinians are asking people to do this towards Israel to protect their rights and to achieve their freedom. And what's being done is this kind of Orwellian twist whereby by actually criminalizing the right to boycott, whether it's in the UK or in the United States, it's actually creating an Israel exception, like that somehow Israel is the only one that needs to be protected from any practice of boycotts or divestment or sanctions. And we've been seeing this in the UK, I think through local councils. I think even the government has been trying to push for different kinds of methods of basically, criminalizing BDS for all intents and purposes. In the United States, it's absolutely pervasive from Congress all the way down to state legislatures. And they're going after activists, they're going after companies. And so it's a very aggressive attempt to really make Palestinian nonviolence itself criminal. And this really echoes the way that Israel itself is completely intolerant of Palestinian nonviolence. Now, this is not to say that we cannot debate like the impact or the strategies or the utility of BDS. These are debates that Palestinians and allies have all the time. But the fact that that right is being questioned because it's being applied against Israel, because it's being applied against a self-proclaimed Jewish state, somehow that makes the right to boycott suddenly problematic, suddenly dangerous, suddenly racist, suddenly violence. This needs to be questioned. This is a huge form of anti-Palestinian racism that's operating to this day. And finally, the third point I want to bring up is the denial of identity. And here again, there are many things we can unpack, but what this is in essence, and the way we're seeing it manifest, especially today, is really this attempt to kind of toxify Palestinianness, both Palestinian, to be a Palestinian or to be associated with Palestine in any way, like to toxify Palestinianness by essentially fusing it with anti-Semitism. I'm sure many of you have encountered this in your own activism in your day-to-day lives. And this toxification is being seen in universities, where students and faculty members who speak out on Palestine, who try to hold Palestine events, they face pressures from university administrations. There could be legal actions against them. There are pro-Israel groups that are also targeting them. They're also like blacklisting them online, things like Canary Mission. You were seeing this on social media, where especially over the past few months, I'm sure you've seen how Instagram and Facebook have been, and even Twitter has been sort of like deleting and censoring all kinds of Palestine content, including something as basic as a live feed from the ground. We're seeing this in policy debates, where what is allowed and acceptable in public and political debate. It's again, any mention of Palestine is to try to make it toxic, make it untouchable, make it something that no one should be allowed to bring up, including by Palestinians themselves. Now, prime engine of this, again, I'm sure many of you know this, is through the IHRA definition, which has really become one of the foremost methods to apply this anti-Palestinianness. Now, for those who are less familiar with it, the definition is portrayed as a working definition of anti-Semitism. And many of the examples, the guiding examples that they give are, of course, very clear cases in which that is anti-Semitism. But six of the, apologies, I forgot the number, but I think that 6 of the points, for example, relate to Israel. And there are things which are inherently political that has now been conflated as somehow being racist. And 2 of the most the most egregious ones in particular is the idea of setting double standards of behaviors that you wouldn't apply to any other country or any other democratic country. This idea that claiming that Israel is somehow a racist endeavor. The irony is that many Israelis, Jewish Israelis here in Israel right now, were probably in violation of those clauses of the IHRA definition. Like, these are political issues which can be discussed here, yet somehow in places like the UK and the United States, those are things that just cannot be touched. What it's also asking is that saying that for Palestinians to even dare say that their entire uprooting, their entire displacement, and everything that has happened before 1948, after 1948 to this day, that what's happening against them is not racism. Like, you're basically saying that to be a Palestinian is to be the antithesis of Israel and what the Israeli project is trying to do. And therefore, by definition, to be a Palestinian is to be an anti-Semite. Whether it may not say that explicitly, but this is basically how the definition is being used. This is the intent around its application. And we are seeing it, again, through the fact that state legislatures or parliaments are now approving the IHRA definition, which now poses real serious threats for Palestinians to even express their basic identity, let alone talk about the loss of their lands and society back in 1948 or any time after. And I mean, I could speak endlessly about this, but this is really the core of it, whereby, and it's very alarming how quickly the IHRA definition is spreading, essentially to make that happen, to create that vibe, that to be Palestinian, to say anything about Israel that is critical to center Palestinians is inherently racist. And this needs to be pushed out. And tied with this, and again, this is something that should be interrogated more, and it's tied with this idea of Israel as a racist endeavor, is to really critique what it means when we talk about Israel as a quote unquote Jewish state. It has become so normalized in public and political discourse to think of Israel as a Jewish state. Like, yeah, of course it's a Jewish state and it should be a Jewish and democratic state with secure borders, etc. What does it mean to be a Jewish state? What it means in practice for Palestinians is that they're being asked, for example, if you're a refugee, you are being asked to accept a sort of expiry date on your right of return. Refugees have the right to return in any part of the world, and Jews developed Zionism precisely to say that we have a right to return to our historical lands after nearly 2,000 years. Somehow there's now an exception, whether in historical right or international legal rights, that Palestinians have to accept an expiry date on their refugee status as right of return. This is a Palestine exception that's being put by asking for a Jewish state. It's the same with saying, like, for a two-state solution, that somehow Israel should maintain security dominance between the river and the sea, even if you have a Palestinian state. So what you're saying is that Palestinians are inherently going to be constant, permanent dangers. They're the ones who are threats. They're the ones who are dangers to stability and security. What about Israel as a danger to Palestinian security, to Palestinian safety? Like, it's flipping the power dynamics in a very strange way and saying that Palestinians have to accept some kind of subjugation under the Israeli state. And a third example, I myself am a Palestinian citizen. I have Israeli citizenship and passport. I live inside the state of Israel here in Haifa. I have a blue ID card. And what it means when people tell me that you should accept a Jewish state or recognize a Jewish state is to say that I need to accept my inferiority. I need to accept my racial inferiority. I need to accept that I will not have equal rights, equal status to a Jewish citizen. I may get some kind of rights. I might have the right to vote, some kind of social services and benefits, might even be able to have representation in the Knesset. But when the state decides that I'm threatening the Jewishness or threatening the Jewishness of the state or the Jewish privilege of a fellow citizen here, I am a problem. My rights need to be contained, and I need to accept that I'm going to be inferior. That is a form of anti-Palestinian racism. Now you understand why people promote the idea of a Jewish state and what Zionism means to a lot of Jews around the world and Israelis here. But what it's asking of us is to say that Palestinians need to understand that they're unequal, that there is a superiority and a hierarchy of rights. And this is, by any human rights standards, by any moral standards, this should be unacceptable. And so these are just some of the ways that I think it's important for us to interrogate, to question even some of the basic terms that we use, to understand how this might manifest. What does it mean for the individual Palestinian next to you? What does it mean for our public discourse? What does it mean for our political path forward? This is by no means, again, an exhaustive set, but I hope these will help spark some thoughts. And I'll stop here to hand over for a Q&A discussion. I'm sure there might be some questions. Take it forward, Mahmoud.
Well, thank you very much, Amjad. I thought that was really interesting and clear and illuminating, and I'm sure everyone else agrees. So we've had a couple of questions come via the Zoom messages. If you've got any more, please feel free to ask them. I'll add them to my list. So the first question we have is from Keith, who asks whether there are any journals in which Jewish and Palestinian writers are publishing papers and articles jointly. And I might add on to that, are there any publications generally that you can recommend where Palestinian writers are platformed at all, if we want to kind of diversify our sources?
I'm going to be extremely biased right now. So the magazine that I work for, 972 Magazine, I apologize for plugging this in. So we are actually a Palestinian Israeli team with Palestinian editors, of course, with Palestinian writers. The site has evolved over the years to also be more inclusive and diverse in this respect, and founded by primarily Jewish Israeli and American Jewish writers who, whose politics, also were reflected in the article. reporting, providing analysis on the ground in ways that were done a decade ago and certainly aren't being done now. And this is the kind of project I'm very proud to be a part of, and that I'm, of course, as an editor here, I'm guiding and shaping. And we're hoping to kind of set a model of what that kind of cooperation looks like. Now, there are several kind of other outlets. I don't want to mention them by name because I'm about to critique some of them. When we look at sort of like these joint Palestinian and Israeli projects, we need to question, at its most baseline, the difference between coexistence and co-resistance. So in the idea that there are a lot of outlets which may be Palestinian Israeli, or organizations which are Palestinian Israeli, which maybe operate along the line of coexistence, which seems like a strange thing to critique. But and it's not that they don't do valuable work or that they're promoting important things or that they believe in human rights, etc. But it's important to critique the politics sometimes to make sure, especially that it's not issues of like tokenization of one side or the other. That the discourse that they're expressing recognizes the power dynamics between a Jewish Israeli producing a writing versus a Palestinian producing a writing. So I'm proud to say that 972 is very mindful and conscious of that, and something that we're doing on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, etc. I'm not sure how many similar projects are like us. I want to say that we have quite a unique space in that media outlet, media space. But I would recommend many other. There are kind of the more. Like you basically have a range of outlets ranging from like Electronic Intifada to Mondo Weiss. You have American outlets now like Jewish Currents, for example, which was mentioned. We're also doing really fantastic work and bringing in more Palestinians and critical perspectives. And even now in mainstream outlets, we're also seeing this effort to bring in more and more Palestinians. So it's they're not like specific outlets I would mention, but I would always encourage just keep that wide range. Aside from like media outlets themselves, if you especially want to hear from like Palestinian voices, there are groups like Ashabaka, which is a think tank that's gathering a very wide range. It's very also active. Okay, Makan also is quite associated with quite a few of these groups. Also kind of allieships with various organizations. So these are just like a few examples that I would give.
Great, thank you very much. I'll be sure to check a few of those out. So we have a slightly challenging question from Yossi, who says that as they understand it regarding BDS, a lot of Palestinians are actually against, or at least do not support BDS, because Israeli goods are sold in Palestinian areas and lots of Palestinians work or travel in Israel every day. So is that your experience that regarding Palestinian views of BDS?
First of all, BDS does not entail like an all-encompassing system, just completely disassociating from anything Israeli. So, for example, I, as a Palestinian citizen, I live in Israel. I have to pay Israeli taxes. I get benefits from the Israeli state system, and I use Israeli money. And it's the same in the occupied territories. It's Israeli shekel that's being used because there's no permission to have like a Palestinian currency. The economic regime that exists under occupation is inherently that it's the Israeli systems of infrastructure, of economy, of taxation, which operates there. So there's an understanding that in the current conditions, Palestinians cannot separate from the Israeli system. This does not mean that we use the shekel. This does not mean that we can't use certain Israeli roads if available. What it does mean is that we want to be strategic with what are we boycotting, and to try to promote self-sufficiency. If we are sort of entrapped in this system, which has dependent on the Israeli economy and Israeli companies, etc., then we need to decide where it goes. And BDS, for example, has also that it recommends that it identifies as contributing to, for example, settlement expansion on occupied territory, which is a violation of international law. It raises issues of academic and cultural boycotts because of historical precedent, including with apartheid South Africa. And this is usually around institutions, not individuals. And there's a very important distinction between that. So just because Palestinians are kind of forcibly dependent on many systems of the Israeli economy or the state, etc., does not mean that they do not support BDS. It's not equated. In fact, the large majority of Palestinians support BDS. They overwhelmingly see it as a legitimate means of resistance. Even before BDS, you have many precedents of strikes and boycotts, like the first Intifada from 1987 onwards to 92, 93, which was also a form of its own kind of domestic boycott against Israeli goods, and basically to increase Palestinian self-sufficiency. Like, why do we have to buy from Israeli like milk companies where we can try to support Palestinian farmers or Palestinian workers? And this is, of course, extremely difficult because the occupation and the systems that are in place, even inside Israel, inherently try to tilt the economic power towards Jewish Israelis, whether you're a citizen on the side of the Green Line or even a settler in occupied territories. But there's a strategy behind it. It's not just like boycott everything. There's strategy behind it. And there are many different ways to interpret it. But again, I would highly recommend going to the BDS website itself, which sets the guidelines rather than assuming what it stands for. So.
Thank you. We now have a question from Heather that I think definitely concerns Na'amod's approach to Israel-Palestine, so I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it. Heather asks whether you think that the UK Jewish tendency to focus on opposing the occupation rather than talking about the Nakba and apartheid, and whilst that's perhaps intended strategically, do you think that focus inadvertently supports this kind of anti-Palestinian racism?
It's an important question. It's obviously understandable why there's a lot of emphasis on the occupation. But here I would definitely encourage and challenge everyone here to always push it back to 1948, if not before. And there are many reasons for this. I mean, historically, the occupation that you're seeing, in Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem, that was modeled on a system that applied inside Israel. From 1948 to 1966, all Palestinian citizens, my grandfather and also my parents for a short while, they lived under military rule. So the military regime in the territories that existed in Arab communities inside the country, who had citizenship and who were supposed to be given equal rights. And so there was almost 20 years in which Israel experimented with the military regime, which literally had permits, it had checkpoints, it had bans on all kinds of political activity. 20 years to build that, and then it got projected onto the Bank in Gaza. Like 1967 is not the origin came way before. And you can go back even further. In the end, Israel itself is a product of Zionism. What did it do before 1948? What is Zionism, especially in the Palestinian perception, in its operation as a colonial movement that's trying to create a society on top of another one? Like, there are many ways to keep digging this. And again, even just in to even think about in terms of solutions. I mentioned I'm a Palestinian citizen, but the focus on the occupation means that if we can solve the issue by creating two states, for example, or just having a Palestinian homeland on these specific shreds of territory, and then we give Israel its state, then everything is fine. And this is either explicitly or implicitly saying that Israel can be a Jewish majority state or it's a Jewish state. What does that mean for my rights? Does that still mean that the state can still determine what kind of rights I can or can't access? Does it mean that the Star of David is still the symbol that represents the historical land that my grandfather was from? Does that mean that democracy is still is kind of like, then I can be given the right to vote, but if I even still dare to question Israel as a Jewish state, it's like, if you have a problem, then you go to the Palestinian state rather than being in the homeland in my hometown with my family here. So solving 1967 does not solve 1948 and does not solve it before. Lifting the military occupation alone is crucial, but it's not enough. And this also goes for the question of Palestinian refugees, which I know many people kind of are even almost afraid to engage with, but it's absolutely essential. It's again coming back to what I was mentioning, that it can't be an exception to refugees. What does a solution entail? What do their rights entail? Do they not have a belonging as well to that land? And in the end, the critical question that has to be asked is not just it's not just about Palestinians gaining their rights, but like, does Israel really want to identify itself? And the Jews here really want to establish a state that is based on ethno-national religious supremacy? If that question is not addressed, or if that's the accepted norm for what a solution entails, then Palestinians, for one, have a problem. Because now we're also accepting this exception to be the ethno-nationalist state at a time when we're trying to push states around the world to be the full democracies, to give equality, to give equity and justice, especially to communities under oppression. These are the questions that need to be grappled with. In 1967, only deals with part of it.
Thank you. So we've got only a few minutes left of this section, so I will try and put 2 more questions to you. So the next question is from Hel, and it's about the IHRA definition, And Hel asks, how would you change the definition to touch on the double standards racist endeavor point regarding Israel and Palestine, whilst not putting that at odds with Palestinian liberation? And I might add here, what do you think of the Jerusalem Declaration, which is kind of perhaps the mooted alternative definition of anti-Semitism as an alternative that balances all these factors?
I mean, in the end, it's not my place to define anti-Semitism. I mean, in the end, the first sources to go to are, like, of course, Jewish people, Jewish experts, the Jewish community, and I understand, like, even the IHRA developed from a process of these kind of experiences, and I understand that there may be occasions, of course, where the Palestine activism and anti-Semitism can sometimes overlap. And what I want to emphasize again is that this is not intentional, and that if it ever does happen, that it should be shunned. It is not part of the movement. It's not what we're fighting for. Our movement is centered around achieving our rights, not denying someone else's, let alone demonizing or being racist against someone else. This is the core of the movement, regardless of whatever fringes are around perpetuating those kind of problems. I mean, again, like the issue of like Israel's racist endeavor, like I also mentioned, people here in Israel is still also regarded as a racist endeavor. Like that should not even be there as something of anti-Semitism. Think of like Mizrahi Jews, for example, that when they even came to Israel, many of them understood Israel as like an Ashkenazi, like a white, European project. It was not a project built for them. They were also oppressed. They were also discriminated against. They had certain aspects of Jewish privilege and Jewish paternity and whatnot, but there was also saying that, yeah, Israel was a racist endeavor. In many ways, it still is. This is just within the Jewish community, let alone, again, as we've been talking about, the Palestinians. So whatever definition of anti-Semitism that does require, the very fact that IHRA brings in Israel so much is also the reflection to the extent to which somehow Judaism and Jewishness and Zionism are very consciously being conflated, and this should not be the case. Zionism is a political project. Israel is a political project of which Jewishness is being used, of which being absorbed and applied, and is using it to kind of also assert its right. But that is not the same as Jewishness. That is not the same as Judaism. You don't need to hear me say this. But that needs to be distinguished. And this shift to conflate Jewishness and Zionism is very problematic. There are many, even historically, many Jews, especially when Zionism was coming around, we're anti-Zionists or we're non-Zionists. A lot of Jewish Israelis here, including religious ones or political ones, for example, are anti-Zionists or non-Zionists. The Jewish diaspora as well right now is also questioning, why is Israel being created? Why are we being part of this kind of this racialized state, especially, whether it's British Jews, even American Jews, were like, why are we demanding equality and justice for all people in the United States, and yet somehow we're allowing this, this exception on Israel to do what it wants for racial superiority and racial supremacy. So whatever definition comes about needs to take that into account. Now, the Jerusalem Declaration, I think, was a good, useful response. I think there's still debate. I'm not an expert on it, so I think there's still debate, also critiques that, it was a very well-meaning attempt, and I think it's definitely a much better version. But it also incorporates many aspects of Israel into its anti-Semitism definition, and maybe that it does need to be debated and considered. And I think it's a much better approach to trying to do it. But that needs to be taken into account. The moment you bring in Israel, it means you're bringing Palestinians into the question of anti-Semitism. And if that's going to be the case, then it has to be engaged with members of the community. And this is, again, not to try to define what anti-Semitism is, but it is to make those distinctions, which are very, very important. Because in the process of trying to define a racism, don't be racist against another community as well.
Thank you very much. So I think that brings this section of the event to a close. So thank you very much, Amjad, for your presentation and for those really illuminating answers. I learned a lot and have been given lots of food for thought, and I'm sure everyone else has. If you want to stick around and kind of chip in on anything relevant in the panel, we'd appreciate that, but thank you very much for your time. So now we're going to move on to the panel of speakers discussing anti-Palestinian racism, specifically within the Jewish community. So each speaker is going to make a short initial statement about kind of what they perceive anti-Palestinian racism in the Jewish community to be, and then we're going to go to a general discussion. So our first speaker...
Right, so we're being recorded again. So I think I'm a critic of how loosely the term racism is used, and I think we need to be a lot more precise about its usage. So I think, for me, the core of racism is structural oppression, really. It's how groups of people seem to have unalterable characteristics. That's what people term as race, but I think we have to understand that the term race doesn't exist. It's a concept. Racism exists. So it's structural oppression of groups that are seen to have inalienable characteristics, usually by states, but not necessarily, but it can be powerful agencies. But the key is power. It's prejudice plus power in the popular definition. So at its most extreme, it can lead to genocide, to murder, but then to enslavement and to discrimination. And I think those are the key points, that really it's how state or powerful bodies exclude groups that are seen as second class and subject them to those kind of treatment. Okay, I don't believe it is simply the holding of prejudice when one doesn't have any power. So for me, that I think we can look at subtle forms of racism, and Amjad talks about some subtle and some less subtle forms, such as the non-platforming Palestinian writers, and I think that is important. But I think we need to get to the foundations of the structure of racism that exists in Israel. And clearly Israel is an ethnocracy. It privileges the rights of Jews over all others, but particularly over Palestinians. And most people here will not be very familiar with these things, but Palestinians are divided into three groups. They're divided into the West Bank, where they're subject to a completely different legal system and military courts and utterly discriminatory life. In Gaza, Palestinians are subject to economic blockade and complete control of borders. And in Israel, within 67 boundaries, Palestinians are subject to a whole range of discriminatory laws and issues of housing, education, policing, land ownership, and many others documented in groups like Adalah. So for me, there's no question that Palestinians in Israel are subject to a massive structural racism. Now, the A word, apartheid, has become very controversial within Jewish circles, but maybe we don't need to use it. It's structural discrimination. It is, by my definition, the essence of racism: structural prejudice against a group that leads to their disempowerment with violence, exclusion, and economic oppression. So for me, that's the core of it, not kind of our kind of loose language or clumsy slips, little mistakes we might make, but it's that state suppression and our support for it. It's that, and I think we should focus now on sort of our apologetics for that system, because a very, very large number of people in the Jewish community either directly or indirectly or implicitly support that system. And I think that needs to be our focus. I remember some years ago, I was imagining what Nimrud would look like if they had a policy of no racist speakers. And it does seem to me that almost the entirety of the Israel track would have been wiped out, because so many of the speakers or potential speakers were absolutely committed to some kind of continuation of ethnocracy. And, you know, I'm open-minded if your vision of overcoming that structural racism is through some kind of Palestinian state within 67 borders, and then, of course, ending of discriminatory laws within Israel. I haven't got a problem with that. Or I think as more likely, some kind of one-state solution where there's a single state with equality for all. I think that's a more likely route. But I'm open-minded. But without some kind of advocacy of one of those two positions, I think you are intrinsically supporting structural racism in Israel. And I think your claim, or our claim as a Jewish community, to be anti-racist or even non-racist is really, really exposed. And there's been a big push in recent time in anti-Semitism as racism. That's not an obvious step, and it wasn't always seen in that way. But I think if that's the case, then our apologetics, our justification for structural oppression in Israel is clearly shown up. And I think that has to be our focus. So I think there's lots of subtle forms of anti-Palestinian racism in the West and in Britain, but I think it will be to our strength if we focus on really the big structural forms of oppression that Palestinians suffer and our for them and how we can end them. So I will leave it there.
Thank you, Joseph. Just to remind everyone that if you have any questions for any of the speakers, or indeed for all of them, you can direct those via send questions here in the Zoom chat. And if you want to specify who they're aimed at or not, that's fine. So we're now going to move on to our second opening statement from Leah.
Hi, everyone. How is my sound? Is it all right?
Yeah, it's great. Great from my end.
Hi, I'm Leah Jordan. I'm a rabbi in the British Jewish community, specifically in London. I'm currently the rabbi of Kehillah, North London, which is a small progressive Jewish community in Stoke Newington. I've lived in London for a decade. As you can hear, I am not a native Londoner. I grew up in the United States. And I think the reason I was invited onto this panel, among many reasons, is that I have experience of years and years growing up in the Jewish community and now working institutionally in it as a professional Jew, as one could say. And I also am a founding member of Amjad. So some of the things I'm going to share are certainly things that I have learned through doing organizing with Amjad. So who am I beyond that? I wanted to open with an anecdote that I think gets to the heart of my experience of anti-Palestinian racism in the Jewish community, which is a memory I think about a lot, which is I think I was about 10 years old and I was in Kansas City, which is a pretty big metropolitan area in the middle of the United States, quite a decent sized Jewish community. And I was in the community center at what I still think of as if the Kansas City Jewish community was an open village and had a square, the Jewish community entrance would be that. If you sat there most days, you might see something like 30% of the active Jewish community walk by you. And I was there and I was 10 and they were having us build a replica of the Western Wall, of the Kotel, of the Wailing Wall in the Old City in Jerusalem, and then putting our little papers, our little notes to God in the wall. And I grew up in a progressive Zionist household, liberal Zionist, Reform Jewish kid. And this was like very normal. This was a nice summer camp activity. And it was very nice. And I think that I go back to that memory a lot because I think there was no mention of the Palestinian homes that were removed for the parts of the Kotel that we were creating to have access to. There was no mention of where the old city sat within a larger picture in Israel-Palestine. There was no mention of any history beyond this Western Wall. And I think if I have an experience very deeply, unfortunately, as a Jewish person growing up in the Jewish community of racism against Palestinians, it's the experience essentially and primarily of them being made to be invisible or to be erased. And as I grew up, that was not much challenged. In fact, I think the thing that became worse is that not only were Palestinians invisible or erased and not spoken of, when they were spoken of, they were a threat. They were something that was dangerous to some aspect of Jewish communal life. That was the understanding. And I share all of this because I think it's very painful and because I think there's so many of us, unfortunately, here who can resonate with that or have seen that. And I think we need to look that in the face and think about it systematically as Amjad and Joseph have done a bit, but also just anecdotally as the experiences that shape us. So fast forward, I spent the last couple years before coming back to London just now living in Baba Zahra near Sheikh Jarrah in Palestinian East Jerusalem by the Damascus Gate, and learning a little bit of Palestinian Arabic. And I mention that only because I am still unlearning these things that I was brought up with, and that has been part of my process of unlearning it. And what are these things? So I think Amjad, as Joseph said, really did our work for us, and everything else is commentary, but I know that Naamod would want us to focus on very overlapping items to what Amjad pointed to us to. So what are these things we're unlearning? Talking about Palestinians without them being there. I think that's the number one, and the one that I think of most strongly in that early memory. Nakba denial and erasure in general of Palestinian experience, of dispossession, and of Palestinian history, both the terrible, like the Nakba, and also just cultural history in general, and tropes. So as we've mentioned, that Palestinians are a threat, that they're too biased, that they're violent. And what else can I offer beyond that? I guess coming here, I'm thinking, so why am I one of the, unfortunately, so few institutional Jewish leaders who speaks about this? Well, there is a lot of pressure and a price to pay in the Jewish community for speaking about this because of this structural racism that we are part of and that we're talking about. So one last anecdote is I was one of many people, many Jewish activists who was part of organizing Kaddish for Gaza in 2018, when something like 4 dozen Jewish activists went to Parliament Square in London and stood in solidarity with those who were murdered by the IDF at the march to the border, in solidarity with protesters in Gaza. And after that event, the institutional pressure from donors within the Jewish community to denounce people who were there and to endanger their livelihoods was so intense that it's something that I still reflect on to this day, and something that I think is if there's one direction we need to go, it's to confront that and to think about how that can be changed. And I hope we do that in the later half of this panel. And the racist tropes that came out of that too. Again, that are some of the same things that Amjad and Naamod are asking us to think about. And then finally, I just wanted to say the intentional conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is horribly destructive. So let's be clear, anti-Zionism is about solidarity with Palestinians. Anti-Semitism is about the Jewish conspiracy. So I guess I would conclude by saying that the reason I'm here, and that this is something that matters to me personally, separate, I don't know if separate is the word, but beyond solidarity with Palestinians, which is the core of what we're talking about today, is that this anti-Palestinian racism is twisting the Jewish community and our Jewish tradition. And we will not achieve a liberated world without a deep commitment to our shared humanity. And that has to do with looking at these realities in the face and talking about them and working daily to change them. I'll hand it over.